Hello and welcome back. Did you know that Photoshop is now nearly 35 years old? And as it's gotten into middle age, it's put on a bit of extra weight, it's got a bit flabby around the edges, and it now needs to go on a diet so that we can trim it down and make it perform like it used to. So in this video we're going to show you how to get rid of some of those tools that you're never going to use, how to set some of the settings to make it work even better, and restore it to its youthful performance. So let's dive in and take a look. Now the first thing we'll do is we'll look at cleaning up the interface with Photoshop and set up the toolbars and various other options for their best performance, and then we'll look at some of the other things under the hood that can help to improve performance if it's not working correctly for you. And firstly, if you're new to using Photoshop, it comes with a default workspace which inexplicably is not the optimum for working with photography. I don't know either why that comes out. If you go into the window workspace, and if you've just started Photoshop and started working with it, what you'll have is what's called the Essentials or default workspace, which is not really the best for photography. So the very first thing we can do is we can come down and we can change the workspace to be optimized for photography. But unfortunately, that again is not so great because it's got this massive great panel here with the adjustment presets, which take up a lot of space where your adjustment layers should be visible. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But firstly, let's go over to the main toolbar, which is on the left-hand side. And what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of the tools that you're never going to use. And they're only taking up space on your toolbar, likely to confuse people that don't know exactly what they're doing. So let's tidy that up. So to do that, we go to the Edit menu, we come down to Toolbar, and then that gives us the options for this left-hand toolbar. And what we can do is we can come down through these various tools and decide which ones we want to see and which ones we don't. And we can remove them. And if you find later on that you want to reinstate some of those tools that you've deleted, that you've suddenly decided you might want, well, you can just do this in reverse and go back in and re-establish the tools. So first group of tools, they're all ones that we're probably going to use, the selection brush, all of these other tools. Now the magnetic lasso tool was a tool that came in some years ago, but it's really been taken over by the quick selection tool and the magic wand tool. So I'm going to get rid of that, and all we do is click on that, drag it over to the right hand side, it gets docked over there and disappears from our toolbar. So we'll come down, follow these other tools, they're all ones that we use, the crop tool and so forth, the eyedropper tool, the healing tools, all very useful. The brush tool, clone tool, history tools, adjustment brush tool. Now, I'm not a great fan of the adjustment brush tool. You might find that you like it, but I certainly don't, so I'm going to get rid of that. I don't really want it. And then we come down to the tools that you should never use. And I covered these in an earlier video, and these tools all work directly on the image. And that's a big no-no in Photoshop. We always work on an adjustment layer or a separate layer. So none of these tools are of any use to us whatsoever. So we can just simply drag them over to the right-hand side and get rid of them. And then we come down to the gradient tool, which we do use quite a lot. And then things like the blur tool, again, it works directly on the image, so we don't want that. And the smudge tool and the sharpen tool, we have an adjustment layer for sharpening if we want to do that. And then the infamous dodge and bird tools, which are also terrible, work directly on the image. We don't want to have a bar of those, so we'll get rid of all of those tools. If you use text on your images, you certainly want to have the type tools. And you may also use the pen tools, and so we can leave those there. Then there's selection tools, the hand tool, and so forth. And so we've pretty much gone through the whole toolbar and got rid of all the ones we don't want. And then down at the bottom here, we've got a few other tools that we may or may not want to see. Now, we certainly want to see the quick mask mode, and we may want to see the twin screen mode if we're working that way. But the generate image mode, no, I don't want that at all. And what's that one? That's the extra tools. We'll have that one. And so we'll go and call that done. And now our toolbar on the left hand side is now cleaned up. We've got only the essential tools that we need, and we've already simplified things quite a lot. So now that we've cleaned up the toolbar on the left hand side, we've got rid of all of the clutter of the tools we never use, we can now go over and address the panel on the right hand side that contains most of the important information we need to work on. And if we've set our workspace to the photography workspace, we've got this sort of a layout, and it's again not ideal. Firstly, the panel's too narrow. I've got this really large screen. I've got a wonderful large preview of my image, but I could drag this panel out, make it a little bit bigger so I can really see what's going on. Then I can just then quickly resize my image to fit the screen. And now I've got some panels to work on. Firstly, at the very top, we've got a tab group here that's got the histogram and the navigator on it, and when I zoom in, it just shows me where I am on the image. I find that pretty well useless. So, and the histogram, if I need to see a histogram, I can just open up a curves adjustment layer. I can see the histogram. So as far as I'm concerned, they're taking up space that I don't need. You might decide that you like them, so you could keep them. But if you want to get rid of any of these groups, you just right mouse click on this little menu item on the right hand side, and I'm just going to close that group entirely. And now I've got this very large panel for my adjustment layers, types, or so on, and including the presets and your presets. We can shrink our panel up because the most important thing to see is all of the adjustment layers as we've worked on an image. And by default, it'll probably be showing very small icons here, and it's really hard to see the size of these things. So if you come down to a space on the layers panel that is blank, right mouse click on it, and I can go and I can make those thumbnails quite large, and I can really clearly see here, I can see all of my masks, I can see the types of adjustment layers, and that's really easy for me to navigate through. But then we've got all of these adjustment layer types up here that we can also access via the bottom of the layers menu down here. And again, inexplicably for Adobe, they've put all of the adjustment layer types in that top toolbar except the solid color one. If you want to do a solid color fill, you can't do it via the little icons. You've got to come down to this menu. Why they haven't included it up there, I don't know. And in fact, some of these adjustment layer types you're probably never going to use anyway. So again, another bit of bloat, but we don't have the opportunity to remove those. But one thing you can do if you decide is you can take these adjustment layers and this group and drag it out of there and slip it into this little small column down here, and so that gives us even more space for our adjustment layers. And then if we want to create a new adjustment layer, we just click on that little box. This flies out, and if we can drag it down, and we can make that a little bit wider if we want to. And so let's say we want to create a new adjustment. Here it is. Here's the adjustment panel, and you can also resize that. Now, the only problem with doing it this way is that when you create a new adjustment layer, it's covering up part of your working image, so you may or may not like that. What we can do is we can drag that panel and put it back up in the top of the workspace, drop it in there, and it stays within there. We've still got enough space to see all of our adjustment layers, and then we can just resize that to suit, and that works pretty well. Okay, so far so good. I think we've seen enough of this image on the screen, so let's change that and look at something else for a little while. So we've got the workspace quite tidy, but there are some other toolbars and panels that we need to have visible for us. So by default, we've come into the photography workspace. We've now got docked in here. We've got our history panel. We've got our actions, and depending on whether you've got a lot of actions or not, they'll appear there. We've got some of the clone source details, and as we just demonstrated, we've got our adjustment layer types and some libraries there as well as another group. But there are other things that you will probably want to have. So to make those visible, we just go up to the toolbar at the top, we go down to window, and we can see down here, these are all the different types of panels that we can add. Now you might find that, for instance, if you do a lot of text on your images, you may want to add the character panel, and again that will just dock in there. Let's have a look and see what else we've got. As I said, we had the histogram before, we've got the history, we've got some various other styles here. So all you need to do is come down here and note them and decide which ones you want. And again, if you're doing text, you might also want the paragraph styles one. We've got various other things. Most of those you're probably not going to use, but of course your actions and so forth are really important. And the last thing that we need to have a look at is the contextual taskbar, which is a new addition to Photoshop. And by default, when it was introduced, it would sort of float around on the bottom of the screen somewhere. Really annoying, getting in the way of things. And so the next thing we'll do is we'll get that out of the way. We still need to use that because it's very handy, particularly if we're using generative fill or something like that. But having this floating around in the middle of the workspace and sitting on top of your image information is not the way to go. So what I do is I just grab this little bar on the left hand side, drag that up, and I put it right up at the top on the right hand side because none of the other contextual tools overflow there. I can just move it up there, but what I need to do is the three little dots on the right hand side. I just say pin it in that position. It's already marked to be pinned. Just click on that and it will always appear up there. So that's already gotten rid of a lot of clutter off the workspace. And next we'll have a look at some of the ways we can slightly improve the performance of Photoshop using some other of the preferences. Now, very important before we go in and look at those preferences, once we've got this workspace set up the way we want it, we need to save that so that when we reopen Photoshop the next time we go to use it, it'll come back the way that we've set it. So to do that, we go back up to the window menu, we go to workspace, and you'll see here that I've already created a few versions as I've been preparing this. But let's say, let's save the new one and we'll call it a new workspace. And just to be different, I'll call it Michael 4. And you'll see here we've got a couple of options. Panel locations will be saved. That's these panels on the right hand side. Keyboard shortcuts, menus and toolbars are optional. Well, we modified the toolbar, so we want that, and we modified some menu items, and we might as well, if we've got any keyboard shortcuts set up, we might as well save those as well. So now that's now saved, so that next time you go into Photoshop you can just automatically have this set up the way you want. Now I've already got a whole bunch of other workspaces in here that I don't need, so I can just go and delete those now. Let's go and have a look at the ones I want. Well, I'm up to number 4 now, so let's go and get rid of that one, and they'll go, and then I can go through and delete those other ones. I won't do that, that's obviously a bit boring, but if you have a workspace saved that you don't want any longer, you can just delete that. So now the next thing we can do is we can do some little tweaks to Photoshop to set the performance to work the way we want it to work. And some of these will differ depending on the performance of your computer, and some may or may not be available to you. So the first thing we do is we go into our Preferences menu, and that is on a Windows machine, it's under Edit, Preferences. It might be in a slightly different location on a Mac, but you will be able to find it. Firstly, let's go to the General section, and we'll scroll through these different panels to see where we can improve things. Now, firstly, the General one, most of these things you can tick or untick as you see fit. You'll see here that I've got a few ticked. But one here that's important is when we're doing image interpolation, and that is when we're resizing images, particularly if we're going to print. Mostly you're going to be downsizing if you've got a computer that's, a camera that's 20 or more megapixels in size. When you're printing, you're probably going to be resizing, downsampling the image. What you can do here, set by default, bicubic automatic is the best option for image resizing, and that will automatically be the choice when you go into the image resize menu. So set that firstly, and that's in the General section. Now the next thing is we move down to the Tools options. There are a whole bunch of options here. You can see here tooltips will show when you hover on a tool, various other things. The flick panning is a feature in Photoshop when you're dragging around the photo on screen and let it go, and it sort of floats for a little while. I find that that's quite annoying, so I've turned that off. We can turn the zooming with the scroll wheel on, so that if we have a mouse with a scroll wheel, zooming in and out becomes really easy to do. So that's another tool that can help you improve your performance. And then next thing, if we go down to file handling, this is where there's a couple of critical things. Firstly, what we want to do is change our automatic saving option. Save it to, or change it to every 5 minutes, because if you're working away on an image and for some reason your computer crashes or Photoshop crashes, which it does every now and then, if you set this to do a auto save every 5 minutes, once you reboot Photoshop, it will bring back the image, and at worst you'll lose 5 minutes of work. Another option here is to come down to the maximize Photoshop and Photoshop big file compatibility. By default, again, another strange Adobe thing, it says to ask. So every time you go to save a file, it's going to ask you, well, if you don't maximize the compatibility, if it goes back into Lightroom can't read it. So change it to always maximize compatibility. You can ask it to request you to select the options when you're saving as a TIFF file. That's pretty standard. But this saving and maximizing compatibility is really important. And there's another one up here that says save as to original folder. Well, that just doesn't work. I brought this up with Adobe probably a couple of years ago, spent an hour or so on the phone with their support people. They couldn't get their head around the fact that I wanted to, when I say save as, I want to give the file a slightly different name, but I want to retain the image file name. I wanted it to go back to the original folder, and all it does is it just goes back to the last folder you used, whether that was the source folder or not. It doesn't matter, and even though you tick this box, it just doesn't work. So there are a few little gremlins in the back end here that just don't work, but these are the important ones to change. And let's go down and look at the performance options, because if your computer is running a little slow, you can change a few things here, but you need to be a little bit careful. Firstly, you can decide, let Photoshop decide how much memory it's going to use, and depending on how much RAM you've got, you can increase that if Photoshop's running a little bit slowly. And of course, if you have a modern computer with a modern graphics processor, you want to make sure that the graphics processor is engaged, and there are some settings there that you can use to enhance the performance. And while we're on this panel, we can jump in here and have a look at the number of history states that Photoshop will remember. And by default, I forget what it has by default, but it's a lot less than that. You want to make sure that you've got at least 50, maybe more than that, steps of history recorded, so that if you need to go back over what you've done and undo some things, you've got hopefully at least all of your steps during the processing to go back over and check via the history panel up here. But yeah, if you set that to at least 50, then you've got options for being able to go back and review your history. And then while we're looking at this, we can go and have a look at the scratch disks. Now, this computer has 2 hard drives, so I'm using the D drive, which is a very large drive, contains most of my image files. I can use part of that as a scratch disk where Photoshop temporarily stores information, and if you only have the one hard drive, you probably don't have much option, but again, by having a larger scratch disk, you can allow Photoshop a bit more space to temporarily hide things on the disk while you're doing other things, and it will help to speed up the processing. Now, and then one last thing to come down here is the product improvement section. Now, there's been a bit of controversy recently about Photoshop or Adobe using your images that are stored on the cloud to train their AI machines, and you may or may not be happy for that to happen. If you don't want Adobe to be looking at your images, untick this box that says I would like to participate. No, I don't want to participate. I don't want you looking at my photographs, and leave that there. That will give you a little bit of more option to ensure your privacy of your photographs. So there are all of the options within the edit preferences section. Let's have another look at another image, because we're getting sick of looking at that one in the background. And we'll have a look at a couple of other little options that might help improve things if your Photoshop's running a little bit slowly. And as I said earlier, with any of these tools that we select, let's select the quick selection tool. When you select this tool, we get a new contextual toolbar at the top, and we have a way that if for some reason this tool's not working the way it should, we can reset that. Now, next to the type of tool, if you click on this little down arrow, we've got various presets if you have them, or you can come over to this little gear symbol and you can then reset that tool if for any reason it's not working properly. And that applies to all of the tools in Photoshop. You just have to find that little down arrow and then reset the tool, and it hopefully might then clear any issues that you've got with it. And another one with the quick selection tool, one point is that when you make a selection, let's just find somewhere on this image to make a selection. If you're trying to get a nice even selection, what you need to do is to make sure that you tick this little box that says enhance the edge, which means that it's going to give you a better result along sharp edges, and it will be a little bit of a smoother result. So that's another handy tip that will help you to get a better selection. And when you're dealing with both Photoshop and Lightroom, when you go to save an image, and if you go to File, Save As, which in theory Photoshop will go back to the source folder and save it for you, but of course we know that that doesn't work. But the options for saving your file will be determined by your settings in Lightroom, and you need to go to your Lightroom preferences to determine how Photoshop is going to save the file. So it's not within Photoshop, it's within Lightroom that those preferences are set up. And one last thing is just making sure that when you're working on your photographs, you've got the correct color management set up. So if we go back to our edit menu, come down to our color settings, you need to make sure that when you're working on an image and you're working on your monitor, if your monitor can handle pretty much the majority, 90% or more of the Adobe RGB color space, you want to set your working space to Adobe RGB. Now, understanding that your image color space is probably going to be ProPhoto RGB, but your monitor can't display that. But your working space for viewing the images needs to be set to Adobe RGB, and with this conversion option over here, Adobe will convert the image information, the color information, into what's viewable on the screen. Very important to set that up correctly. And then lastly, just looking at profiles, if you're opening an image that has no color profile, for instance, something from a flatbed scanner may not have a color profile assigned to it, you will need to know that when you're opening the file. And then if you're pasting from one image into another image and they're in different color spaces, you need to know, because that will affect the color. So they're just a couple of extra things to be concerned with when you're setting up your version of Photoshop. So there are some tools to help you streamline Photoshop, put it on a bit of a diet and get rid of some of the bloat, and it will then work a little bit better for you. So don't forget, when you've made all these changes to the menus and the panels, to go in and save that workspace. Even if you give it a new name, you can just delete the other ones, and then you'll always have this working and layout working for you when you open Photoshop. And when you've made some of these changes to some of the tools, you may need to restart Photoshop for them to become effective. But saving that workspace will save you a lot of time and allow you to work with a consistent layout, and hopefully some of these settings will have helped streamline things for you. Hope that's been useful. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.